Good evening. I'm Daniel Samajewicz, and thank you for joining Maccabi Canada tonight as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Munich Massacre, where during the 1972 Olympic Games, terrorists murdered 11 Israeli Olympians. Joining me tonight is Karen James, who as a Canadian Olympian was a witness to these horrific events. Karen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for asking me to be here tonight.
So, Karen, it's 50 years since the Munich Massacre. What do you remember from the evening of September 5th, 1972?
Well, 50 years ago, and I remember it quite clearly. I had been out late with three other swimmers. We'd been celebrating. We'd finished, the swimming was over, and of course we'd finished our competition, and we'd been at the press building, where the media were, and we were watching the Canada-Russia hockey series there. And it was 3 or 4 in the morning when we left that building, and we're walking back to the village. And I remember standing at the fence around the village, and the 4 of us making the decision that we didn't need to walk all the way around to the main gate, that we could climb this fence. And I remember clearly off behind us, kind of in the shadows, were 4 men. And they were wearing tracksuits, but oddly enough, it registered that they didn't have a country name on the tracksuits, but it didn't impact in any way. And in terms of we made any sense of that. They also, I remember seeing at least one large duffel bag with them. And I remember climbing that fence, and it was so easy to do. I just want to make that pretty clear. You could never do that today. But at those Olympics, the security was very loose, and that was intentional. They wanted the Olympics to be very different from the last time they hosted in Germany in 1936. And so they were very loose and easy with the security. We didn't have any worries about climbing the fence. And so I remember the 4 of us climbing the fence and looking over our shoulders and seeing that those 4 men standing in the shadows joined us as we climbed the fence. Martha and I went to the women's dorm, and Byron and his friend, George, went to the men's dorm. And I remember being awoken within an hour or 2, hearing helicopters and noise and commotion. And so I went with a friend to find out what was going on. This is the day of the 5th. And we were shoved into a building that was actually the Canadian Medical Building. And we were stuck there for the whole day. And from that building, I saw the drama unfolding. We could see the German authorities negotiating with the Palestinian terrorists. I remember the head Palestinian with kind of a white hat on, walking jauntily back and forth. And I can still see to this day, there's been pictures of it, of the Palestinian with the balaclava but pulled over his face with openings for eyes and stuff, where he was holding the Israelis hostage at the window there. So he was on the balcony, and I could see that. And we saw at the end of the day, when the Israelis were led onto a bus, they came out of the building, they were blindfolded and their hands were bound, and they were led away. So there was climbing the fence part in the early hours of the morning, but later that day, I was witness to more.
So what can you tell me about the following days? Because infamously, the games went on, correct?
They did. So the next day was the memorial ceremony in the stadium. And I remember the flags being ordered to be held at half-mast. They were, but then many of the Arab countries raised their flags again. The names of the Israeli athletes were never read out. The ones who were murdered, never read out at the stadium. And Avery Brundage, the head of the International Olympic Committee, said the games must go on. And I couldn't live with that. I had finished competing. Maybe it's easier for me to say, but I did not stay the extra week or the extra few days until the closing ceremonies. I left the village. And yeah, I've talked to friends and people who stayed on, and they said, they never got to talk about it. And it surprised me how many people were traumatized and never got to talk about it. Not it being witnessed like I was, but traumatized by what happened and never having an opportunity to talk about it. And for those athletes that had to go on and compete, for some, it was very difficult. And for many, I don't know. I don't know how they did it.
So, how did being a witness to such a terrifying event impact your life?
It had a huge impact, only I didn't realize for a long time. I came home, went back to university. I'd never talked about what happened. My parents never knew my story about being there and what happened. They knew I was in Munich. I never talked to them about what I saw and even what happened. And I pushed it away, and didn't have anything to do with my Jewish community, my Jewish identity. I pushed all of that away. And it wasn't until one day, 20 years later, more than 20 years later, that I was sitting in a bar across the table from Byron, who was one of the four of us that night. And he looked at me and he said, "We knew they weren't athletes, didn't we?" And I nodded. And that reverberated with me and started the process of thinking a little bit about it, but still pushing it away. But it was very difficult for me. It had more of an effect on me than I ever realized. I started to talk about my experience in the Jewish community when I was asked to chair the swimming for the JCC Maccabi Games in Vancouver. They'd never hosted them before. And I was asked to tell my story. And I told this story in front of 10,000 people. And that was for the very first time I ever talked like out loud like that about what happened. And talking about what happened has been a focus in my life. It's kind of been connecting to my community and not absolving me of guilt, but at least I'm keeping their memory alive. When I tell this story and I read out their names, I've traveled all over North America telling this story to different Jewish communities. I make sure I read out their names and that everybody knows the story of what happened. That's how I'm not redeeming myself necessarily, but that's my purpose when I talk, is to keep their memory alive.
So, a part of keeping their memory alive, you participated in an advocacy program to make sure the Olympics recognize them officially. And after years of silence at the Tokyo Olympics last year, they finally held a moment of silence during the opening ceremonies. So, what were your thoughts during that moment?
Daniel, I have to tell you that I only learned of that memorial service through the Israeli media. I looked all through our Canadian media, didn't see it anywhere. If it was somewhere, it wasn't in my view. And I did see a recording of it, and I was very moved. I feel good that they finally did it. There's no question of that. It was the right thing to do finally. After almost 50 years, they finally read out their names during the opening ceremonies. Yes.
Karen, thanks again for joining us tonight. And before we leave, I would love for you to take a moment to recognize the 11 Olympians and read their names to our audience.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. The murdered Israeli athletes: Moshe Weinberg, Yossef Romano, Ze'ev Friedman, David Berger, Yakov Springer, Eliezer Halfin, Yossef Gutfreund, Kehat Shorr, Mark Slavin, Andre Spitzer, Amitzur Shapira.